Good evening, each one. Good to see you on this Wednesday night for our period of Bible study and worship. We're in part 2 of Troubled Over Death. That's lesson 7, beginning on page 38 in our workbook, Troubled Over Many Things by Connie Adams. But part 2, Troubled Over Death. So a passage we mentioned last week, and we want to start with it tonight, and that's in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 27 and 28. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. The introduction to our lesson there on page 38, the author says, unless the Lord comes first, all of us will face death. Sometimes it will come as a quiet transition, at other times as a monster suddenly crushing life from us. It will come to the young, middle-aged, and to the aged, but come it will. In this lesson, we will look at how we deal with the death of a loved one. There are problems to be resolved by those left behind. And so in the next section, he focuses our attention on coping with grief. I invite you to take your Bibles, be turning to the Old Testament, the book of Job. Our last lesson had many more scriptures, and I think we added some as well. This one going through the stages of grief, not as many scriptures referenced, so we'll add some to supplement the material we'll be going through at times. But as he says at the end of that second paragraph under coping, well, the first paragraph, but second paragraph in our lesson, first paragraph under coping with grief, last sentence, he says, we are all different, and it is to be expected that we will cope with grief differently. I think that's an important statement. It's an accurate statement that we all don't grieve the same way. We don't process grief the same way. And even the stages of grief that we'll get to doesn't mean we go through them step by step. In fact, I'm going to add 3 to the 7 that are there. But a number of those, when we do experience the loss of a loved one, someone very close to us, we will experience a number of those things that we'll touch upon. So in Job, as we think of this book, this particular Bible character, and think about the topic of grief, I know it's quite obvious and apparent why we would go to this book, right? Because after we're introduced to Job, and that God says there's no one like him on the earth, Satan has made the accusation, well, he's faithful to you because why? Yeah, you've built this hedge or like this wall of protection. And Satan's convinced you take those blessings away you blessed him with, and he won't be faithful to you, he'll curse you. So God allows Satan access to come at Job, and he comes at him hard. And Job is blessed with a lot of physical blessings, wealth, and all of that's taken away. And that would be traumatic. That would be very hard to have all of your finances completely gone in just one moment. But what would have caused grief well beyond that is what happens next, and what happens to Job. All of his children die. Now, parents who have experienced the loss of a child, whether a child from, so I think of a young man that we knew up in the Louisville area that had childhood cancer, and I'm trying to think how old Nathan was, but 7, so only a 7-year-old boy, and the grief I know the parents still experience with that great void and loss of their 7-year-old boy, or whether it's your child who those of us, and Dustin's here tonight who was at Baytown, or in Baytown, but Kim Peck, who had cancer, and she had very young children at the time that died of cancer. Or, someone as old, in quotes, as my father, who was 50, almost 51, but his parents were still living when he passed. Just here, you think about Job, and he didn't just lose one, he lost all of them, all at once. 7 sons, 3 daughters, gone. And not just him, but his wife, obviously. He's married, and she suffered all these losses as well right there with him. And as we come to chapter 2, he's in good health, but now he's not going to be, because Satan comes after that next. God says you have to spare his life, and he takes him up to the point where he's in so much misery. When you get to chapter 3, his very first speech is longing and wishing he had never been born. Not just because, no doubt, of his health, but everything that he's suffered so far. And then, of course, his wife's saying, why do you still hold fast to your integrity? Why don't you curse God and die? Then his friends come, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, right? And as we know, they go back and forth through the majority of this book with their speeches to one another, and his 3 friends accuse him of sin, and that's why he suffered all these things. But before they open their mouths and stick their foot in, the very first thing they do was good. When they came to him, they just sat there with him and didn't say anything. Job 2, verse 13. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. Why? What's the last statement? For they saw that his grief was very great. How do you think they saw it? His face, the weeping, whether he's burying his head in his arms, they saw it. And obviously it would be there and so overwhelming, but that's what kept them from saying anything for a week, just sitting with him, because of the grief that their friend was experiencing, the devastation, the devastating losses, plural, that he had suffered. In Job chapter 6 and in verse 2, verse 1, then Job answered and said, oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid with it on the scales. Verse 3, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Think about how heavy that sand of the sea upon you, but oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity. And then in Job chapter 16, and notice there in verse 6, though I speak, my grief is not relieved, and if I remain silent, how am I eased? But again, he speaks of his grief and how it is not relieved. And then in Psalm 6, just a few pages after the book of Job ends, psalm attributed to David, and he says in verses 6 and 7 of Psalm 6, I am weary with my groaning all night. I make my bed swim. I drench my couch with my tears. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows old because of all of my enemies. And so David here speaks of how his eye wastes away because of grief. That implies what then? A lot of crying, a lot of weeping, if his eye wastes away because of grief. And so we're talking about death. We're talking about the loss of a loved one, a spouse, a parent, a child, a very close friend, a grandparent, whatever the loss may be. And obviously, for any normal person connected to that is grief. is sorrow. That's only natural. God made us that way. Even our Savior who came in the flesh grieved at the loss of his dear friend Lazarus. As we think of that very short verse, Jesus wept in John 11, verse 35, which is always been interesting to me, because he came there for the purpose to raise him from the dead, and yet seeing the sorrow of those around him and the sorrow he was experiencing, he still was overwhelmed with emotion, and he wept. It's one thing to say he cried, he shed a tear, eyes watered up, right? But he wept implies much more emotion, doesn't it? All right. Just went through this pretty quickly. Any of your thoughts, comments at this point in time? Okay. So he also has a paragraph there on the topic of beware of the shrine. He said some try to cope by sealing off a room, leaving everything as it was, and resisting any effort by family members to change a thing. Over the long haul, this is not healthy. If there are other family members still at home, this is not fair to them. In the last sentence, he says of that paragraph, this will prolong your agony and hinder the acceptance of reality. Of course, keep in mind, he oftentimes alludes throughout this lesson of losing his wife. Later he remarried, and just last year his second wife passed away, Bobby. They were actually both Bobbies. But that's what he refers to quite a bit in his own experience with that, and a number of the statements made here. Okay, stages of grief. I want to highlight, he has 7, I want to highlight 10. And the first one, again, this is not universal application. And it just depends on the circumstance, it depends on the situation. But sometimes it's shock is where it begins. Now, someone's been sick for a while, and I kind of overheard April and Shirley talking about Lauren Stevens, who just passed, and obviously that wasn't something sudden. He was older, he was battling health problems for a while. Doesn't mean there's no grief, there is. Doesn't mean there's no sorrow, there is. And that loss is still difficult, but it wasn't a shock when you hear that. And some of us have dealt with that and losses. I know when my dad died, he wasn't in the hospital, he hadn't been sick, everything was fine. When we said goodbye that morning as I was heading down from Kentucky to Florida to go to school, and so that was a shock. Lost a cousin who was just 33 years old, but as difficult and as sorrowful as that was, he was born with heart problems and battled that throughout his life, been in the hospital, and things were not going in a good direction. And so that wasn't as like the loss of my dad, in the sense that it was just a shock. It was not expected type thing. But if you experience this, the bereaved person maybe feels a sense of unreality, as though it must be happening to someone else. There's a feeling of being in a dream or a nightmare from which he will awake. And I certainly can relate to some of those statements there at the time. This is the one he begins with, is denial. I added denial and disbelief. But how could someone who had been so thoroughly with us now be gone? How could someone who had been so alive now be dead? Sometimes we feel anger. Again, this is not everyone that goes through these steps, but some do, and this is one he includes, and this is from the book, Why why did this happen to me? It's not fair. Sometimes we even direct anger at the deceased. And as we alluded to last class, sometimes we direct it towards God. Both are completely misplaced, ultimately, of course. That's an emotion that we can experience when we go through a difficult loss, and perhaps a sudden loss. Sadness and deep sorrow. And of course, we talked about grief, but I mean, that's a big part of losing a loved one. And sometimes that sadness and sorrow can even bring one down to a period or stage of depression that can be difficult to climb out of that pit. Notice with me some scriptures from the Old Testament and then the New Testament. They're in Genesis. Genesis chapter 37. So here in Genesis 37, we read the story of Joseph and his brothers. His brothers, of course, envied him. They hated him, couldn't speak peaceably with him because of the favoritism their father Jacob showed him and showered him with. And one day when he was sent to go check on his brothers and the sheep, when they saw him coming, they plotted to kill him. Reuben, the oldest, speaks up on his behalf and he's spared, but they ended up, as we know, selling him as a slave to the Midianite traders who take him down to Egypt. But what story are they going to bring back to their father? Well, they have his coat of many colors, and they take that and they rip it up, and they took a goat, killed a kid of the goats, dipped the tunic in blood, and they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" That's verse 32. Verse 33, and he recognized it and said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And notice verse 35, and all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now we know Joseph is alive, but Jacob is fully convinced that he's dead, he's gone. And so all the emotions he feels, the grief, the process of grief, I mean, that's all real for him. And he's so overwhelmed with it, even when family gathers around to try to offer him comfort, he refuses that. He cannot be comforted, and is just going to go, as he says, down to my grave, mourning for my son. And so sadness and deep sorrow. We see it at the time of Jacob's death at the end of Genesis in chapter 50. And let me go ahead and get some of you all reading. I'll stop hogging it all. Let me start over here with Gil. Everybody make sure you're in Genesis 50 who are reading, and let's take a couple of verses. And that last person can, I guess, take an extra verse. So 2 verses apiece. And just come up this way. Maybe we'll hit Norm before we make the corner. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, Norm probably will finish it up. Go ahead, Gil.
Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel.
40 days were required for him, for such are the days required for those who are embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying."
My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am dying, and my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear.
So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as the household of Joseph his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen.
There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 7 days mourning for his father. Now when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians. And therefore it was named Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan.
Okay. So when he first died, verse 1, Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then later we read in verse 10 how, as they're traveling, came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan. They mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. Just a strong description there of grief. And even the Canaanites of the land observing that this is a deep mourning of the Egyptians. Well, particularly of the household of Jacob, it was a deep mourning. 2 Samuel 18, we recall when Absalom rebelled against his father David, briefly usurped the throne there in Jerusalem, and David had to flee with his men loyal to him, but then David's men and Absalom and his men met in battle, and Absalom fell, even though David had pleaded to his men to spare his life for his sake. Joab did not listen. And David finds out the news, the devastating news, as even any parent that has a child, even if the child's rebellious, obviously you want them to be safe, spiritually safe, physically safe, and so this was devastating to David. And you got that, Jason?
The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son.
So even though he rose up against his own father, took the throne, David did not wish him dead. And when he was killed, it moved him greatly with sorrow, with weeping, and even wishing that it had been him instead and not his son that had died. And we already referenced this, but there in John 11, Jesus comes to Bethany with his disciples. Word had been sent at the beginning of this chapter from Mary and Martha that, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. That's verse 3. And Jesus' immediate initial response to that word or news is verse 4. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus loved everyone, but what that verse is telling us, he had a very, very close relationship with his family. These three individuals were very close to him, and vice versa. And so they knew if we send word to Jesus, he'll come right away. Well, he intentionally didn't come right away. That God may be glorified, and that he may be glorified, and others may come to believe that he is the Christ and the Son of God. In fact, many did believe because of the miracle that took place. As we know, Lazarus was dead 4 days when he was raised up. But as Jesus comes there, let's see. Let's read 28 through 37 and take 2 verses apiece. Lauren, I'll start with you.
When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him.
Okay. Mercer, Drew.
Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but it was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, "She is going to the tomb to weep there."
And when Mary was come where Jesus was, and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, our brother had not died." When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled.
And said, "Where have you laid him?" They said unto him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept.
Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" And some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind and also have kept this man from dying?"
All right.
Yes, he could have, but he was going to do something far greater and extraordinary than just keeping him from dying. But we see the natural grief and emotion. Both sisters expressed the same thing to him. Martha first, now Mary says it to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And you think of no doubt the emotion with those words. And when Jesus saw her weeping, verse 33, sees her, the tears just coming down Mary's face. The Jews came with her, they're weeping. That he groaned in the spirit. He was troubled. His emotions are coming upon him now, seeing all this. "Where have you laid him? Lord, come and see." And then those powerful 2 words, Jesus wept. Sometimes we sing, "Does Jesus care?" I know he cares, right? And we do. We do from this passage and so many others, that we have a merciful high priest who sympathizes with us and was tempted or tested in all points as we are, yet without sin. But he cares, and we know that it's only a natural human response to express grief and sorrow when a loved one has been taken from us. Number 5, regret and guilt. We may think of things we wish we had said, wish we had done, and now it's too late. And so, redeem the time, right? Make the most of every day and every moment with our spouse, with our children. If you have parents still living, with any living parents, if you have any grandparents still living with grandparents, etc. Redeem the time. And sometimes it's not just things we wish we had said or done. Maybe it's how something had been said that you wish you could take back, how things were left between you and this loved one that you can't do anything about now, and that would be more haunting. Masking true feelings, maybe trying to put on that brave face instead of going through this process of grief. That's not healthy or helpful ultimately. Candy Lightner said, "Death takes away, that's all there is to it, but grief gives back." By experiencing it, we are not simply eroded by pain, rather we become larger human beings, more compassionate, more aware, more able to help others, more able to help ourselves. In other words, it's a needed and helpful thing ultimately for us to go through it instead of trying to hold it all in or to mask it. Also, resentment. some may have this feeling, and as we see others going about their life with their spouse, their children still living, their parents perhaps, it's easy to have maybe feelings of jealousy begin to form within us. And when that happens, if it happens, that can become a real test of faith for us. To not give in to that, to not allow that to happen within us. Longing, this is another one that I'm adding. When those that we love die, and this is a quote from a book called The Heart of Grief. I was asked back in 2006 to speak in a lectureship on the loss of a parent. And this is a book that I found a number of quotes from that I thought were good and helpful. And so this is a quote from Thomas Attig, the book The Heart of Grief. He says, when those we love die, we remain poised to feel, to act, to think, to expect, and hope as if they were still with us. We hurt as we meet their absence again and again in public places and in intimate corners of our lives. We long for the past or for their return so that our feelings, actions, thoughts, expectations, and hopes might again find their targets. But this is something that I think many of us who have lost a loved one continue to feel, that longing, because there's that void, there's that absence of that spouse, of that parent, of that child, or whoever that loved one may be, that we long for their return. Thankfully for the Hope of the Christian, which a lot of these books that I was reading didn't have they had some good quotes, but they didn't have always such a heavy emphasis on what we would. The Lord and the Scriptures and the promises and assurances that we have and the hope that we have and the reunion that we read of in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 for those who have died in the Lord, which makes our whole grief process take on a whole different light, doesn't it? And number 9, acceptance. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel 12. And so, with David's great sins of adultery and murder, Bathsheba's husband Uriah, who was killed because of David's actions, Nathan, the seer, the prophet, being sent to rebuke him for it and address that sin. David acknowledges his sin. It's put away. God doesn't take his life, but God doesn't take away the consequences at all from these sins that really plagued David the rest of his life, the first of which begins with his child that was conceived in the sin of adultery. And so let's read 15 through 23, taking a couple of verses each. Are you all there, Ray and Shirley? In 2 Samuel 12, everybody who's reading on this side, please be there. And let's follow along. Go ahead when you're ready, Ray or Shirley, if you want to begin.
Then Nathan departed to his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground.
And the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the 7th day that the child died, and the servant of David feared to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead?
But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David perceived that the child was dead. So David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes. And he came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he came into his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate.
Then his servant said to him, "What is this that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food." And he said, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me."
Okay, I thought of this passage on this particular point of the acceptance. So here's David while the child's alive but very sick. He's fasting, he's praying, he's laying all night on the ground. They try to raise him up, he wouldn't. They try to encourage him to eat, he would not do it. On the seventh day, a week passes, the child dies, and the servants, you can see how afraid they are to even let David know what had happened. They're afraid he might even do harm to himself the way he's been acting. But he senses the way they're behaving and whispering and talking that the child had passed, and they confirmed that when he asked. But he accepted that when that news. He arose from the ground, he washed and anointed himself, changed his clothes. Where's the first place he goes? He goes to the house of the Lord, and he worships. Kind of reminds me of Job, falling down and worshiping God. And when he requested, he set food before him and ate. Not that, okay, he's dead and doesn't affect me, doesn't matter. No, it mattered greatly. But they're confused by his behavior. Verse 21, the servant said to him, "What is this you've done? You fasted, you wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you rose and ate food?" And David said, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I, continue fasting? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." But acceptance, this is the time when we understand truly the finality of what has taken place. Our loved one is dead. He or she will not be coming back. Remember, one of our earlier points was the disbelief, maybe denial. Now there's the acceptance of what has happened, as difficult as that acceptance of it and that truth and reality is. And then going on with life, staying here in 2 Samuel 12. Dustin, you want to grab those verses, please, 24 and 25.
Comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went into her and lay with her. So she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. Now the Lord loved him, and he sent word by the hand of Nathan, the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord.
All right. In a sense, these two verses speak of them moving on and still living life and having another child together. The name that he gives the child means literally beloved of the Lord. But as Brother Adam says in the book, we don't all handle things the same way. Some never seem to recover. Some even turn bitter. Others learn to accept what they cannot change, and they go on. Notice in the book, if you will, the paragraph after going on with life. And actually at the top of page 41. I got this old copy, so I'm looking at the copy all y'all have. As one who has done that, I offer, let me read a little bit more. He says in the paragraph above that, it is a time for surviving parents to pull together, become closer, not drift apart. The loss of both parents was hard to absorb, especially after our mother died. We felt somehow disconnected from the world. Some who have lost a spouse decide to remarry. As one who has done that, I offer a few observations. Be sure you allow enough time to heal the wounds and sort out your own emotions. It is a time for good judgment and not runaway emotions. Some second marriages turn out well while others do not. Don't expect all your friends to be as excited about your new life as you are. They may come as a surprise to you. Some may even treat you as if you're being disloyal to the mate you lost. Other family members may not be overly happy for you either. You will inherit a new set of in-laws. Children may have the hardest time adjusting to a stepmother or stepfather. They may feel that someone else is trying to take the place of their own mother or father. Of course, nobody could ever do that. Bobby and I have been married now for 20 years, and she is the only grandmother my grandchildren know. They could not love her more if she were their blood grandmother. She feels the same about them. I am the only grandfather most of her grandchildren have known. Some children come to readily accept you, and some do not. Both sides of the equation have to work at the new relationships. Children do not always understand the emotional needs of their own parents, and parents do not always understand the struggles their children have with choices made by their parents. Age, health, and circumstances will enter into such choices. He says, in the case of spouses, it is a certainty that one or the other will die before the other under normal circumstances. So make the most of every day the Lord gives you. Remember your vows and give the best you have to make life good for each other. And his final thoughts was, above all else, live so that when death calls and it is your turn to make this transition, you will be ready to meet the Lord and hear him say at the judgment, well done, good and faithful servant. Matthew 25, 21, and 23. And I'll end with this, 1 Corinthians 15. You can go ahead and ring it if you like, 54 through 57. Paul said, so when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen to that. All right, apologize. We didn't get to the questions. I did want to, but our time is up. Jason?
I have gone through this and dealing with it for the last 20 years. One of the things that I think that we have to be very careful of, and the lesson, I have full respect for Brother Connie, but there's a lot of opinions that are in there. We have to be very careful that we don't tell someone that is grieving, well, you shouldn't be doing that. As long as they're not sinning and losing their faith, then we have to be very careful. And he does point out we're going to deal with things differently, but for the sake of those that are here, for the sake of those that are listening, as Christians, we cannot be so hard on each other when we're going through a traumatic experience like this, as long as we're not sinning against God. Now, if it gets to that point, then we need to change our ways.
All right, appreciate it.